Vayakam melech chadash al Mitzrayim, asher lo yada et Yosef. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. What do you mean he didn't know Joseph? The rabbis asked that question. I mean, Joseph was known. It was all in the history books of how this Jew saved the economy and the great contribution of the Jew to Western civilization. Everyone knew that. Everyone knew of the great contribution of the Jews to Germany. Who could forget that? And yet it's interesting, the biblical text says, a new regime entered into who didn't know Joseph. And the rabbi said, who made himself as if he didn't know. And what does the new king say? Again, this is the beginning of Exodus, and I recommend people to read this at the Seder. You should not only read what's written in the Agadah, take the biblical account of the enslavement of this people and the contrast with how they looked when they entered into Egypt for the first time. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them so they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground. So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built garrison cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites the various labors that made them perform. Ruthlessly, they made their life bitter for them with harsh labor and mortar and bricks, with all sorts of tasks in the field. What happened? What happens to every tyrant when he sees a prosperous minority growing, enters into paranoid fear that this minority are not really loyal, and this minority will join a revolutionary force, because tyranny always makes possible revolution, and he felt that they would endanger the security of the people of Egypt. And he says, let us deal wisely with them. Havanit Hartman. And Nachmanides says how he has to convince them to suddenly demonize the Jewish people. He has to convince them to see them as a threat and as a fifth column in the country. Only after, because they lived with the Jews and they were friendly, and Jews cooperated with them. There was no cause for suspicion. So Pharaoh has to demonize and bring up a deep fear in the hearts of the Egyptians, and they began to oppress and enslave a whole people. The contrast between being welcomed and then suddenly being oppressed reminds you of the modern world, of how Jews felt about Germany, where in some way they felt secure. They felt that they were living in the most important cultural center of the world, and many of them didn't even want to marry Polish Jews because they were not cultured. They didn't go to the opera. They didn't study Beethoven and Kant and listen to great music. They were more simple shtetl Jews who spoke Yiddish and who were not full participants in the beauties of Western culture. What you see in the founding memory of the Jewish people, that history is arbitrary. History does not give you a predictable future. What happens in 1 year, in one period, can suddenly change in another. So the founding memory, in my view, is not just a liberation story, it's the fragile, unpredictable quality of human history, the contingent dimension, and not the ordered, predictable, divine, providential model that people have for history. I see history as a jungle of opposition, of chaos, of moments of tranquility, but never knowing certainly when this moment will end. So my founding memory in my theology is History is filled with contingency, with arbitrariness, with a sense of uncertainty, which no one could ever in some way predict. Certainty in history is an illusion. One has to be open to all possibilities in which life could be beautiful and also life can be tragic. When does a human being give expression to noble sentiments, and when does he give expression to demonic sentiments? I don't know. But I know both are there in human history, and I have to be awake to that possibility and not live with the romantic image that man is essentially good and loving and kind, and it's just an aberration when you see him do destructive things. They are both imminently present, and that's what our celebration of Passover is about. It's not only liberation, it's to remember how history moved so radically from Jacob to Joseph. And a new king arose over Pharaoh, by Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph. And therefore he says to his people, let's demonize and destroy this productive minority. They are a source of danger, and we ought to in some way deal with them correctly. So therefore, it's not just liberation and hope and miracle, which everybody has in the Haggadah. The 10 plagues, and we tell stories about the plagues and all the miracles. And there's a certain feeling of security, that God is on our side, and that anyone, you say this throughout the Haggadah, and there was not only one time in history when nations wanted to oppress us, but God, Amad Aleinu, L'chalotenu, people were out to destroy us, and God protected us and saved us. So Egypt becomes for the Haggadah a sense of security. You can't wipe out the Jews. God will always finally enter into the picture and liberate and save Jews. That memory, that hope, which is so present in the Passover Haggadah, is very hard to tell our children and ourselves in the 20th century, in the post-Holocaust world. So it's true that out of the Holocaust came the birth of Israel, but the birth of Israel does not compensate for the tragic dimension of what happened to the destruction of European Jewry. So we can't tell these stories of security and hope and stories that in some way protect us from the arbitrariness of history.